using two case reports or a case report here, a small study there, to generalize about a food group across a whole population or across just as its inherent effects on some sort of outcome is just, it's not how we do this sort of thinking. It's not how scientific thinking evolves. It's not how consensus forms. There's been like a lot of investigation into this question higher up the evidence hierarchy, and we look at those kind of more robust study designs to see if there's any real effect. I don't see how anyone can make the claim that soy influences hormones.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode. Today we are joined by Patrick Elliott, who's going to talk to us about misinformation around soy. Patrick Elliott is a student in human nutrition at the University College Dublin. He's currently doing a PhD focusing on the health effects of a sustainable diet. He does a lot in his spare time. He's also a contributor to My Nutrition Science and has written one article on soy misinformation. He's got a new article out on whether or not the alkaline diet is the cure for cancer. He's also a communication officer at Training 121 and has got a recent article around the Liver King lie. He also is on Instagram at just.health.info. He's also got a couple of papers published around plant-based and vegan diets, one focusing on the vegan diet and obesity, and the other examining the effects of plant-based diets on lipid and inflammation biomarkers. That was a lot, again, as usual with the guests. Firstly, thanks for joining, Patrick. Did I get that right, or is there anything you want to correct me on?
Yeah, that was great. You make me sound a lot more accomplished than I am. Yeah, I think everything was okay. I think one of the papers, the first one I was a co-author on, was it was a secondary kind of analysis of RCT. But other than that, you were spot on.
Perfect. Today, we're going to be talking about one of your articles on My Nutrition Science about soy misinformation. Lots of people believe that soy has a feminizing effect, and this has been ingrained in culture for a long time, this belief. We would like to know whether or not this is true. You've looked into this. First of all, so why is soy particularly a food of interest? And where do you think this claim that soy lowers testosterone comes from?
Yeah, so soy, it's a high protein food. It's I suppose it's quite prominent in Western cultures these days. So let's say the last couple of decades, as I suppose more plant-based diets become more popular, soy is known as a complete protein, which essentially means that it has a lot of these kind of essential amino acids we need, and the building blocks of tissues, muscle tissues, etc., that we need for living essentially. But it is a complete protein, so it has a lot of these in ratios that are high quality. So that's why it's a very popular food group for people eating less meat and less animal products. And it's a type of legume, so it's a bean. It sits within that group, but even within that group, it's a little bit different. So it's a little bit higher protein and higher fat versus other legumes. But actually, soy it's a traditional food in Eastern cultures. So it's actually been, I believe it's about 3,000 years ago, give or take a few years, is when it kind of was first cultivated in Eastern cultures, and it was a staple or is a staple in Eastern cuisines. So that's just kind of, I guess, a bit of a background on soy. Yeah, so there are these compounds in soy. So there are these compounds called isoflavones. They are essentially polyphenols. So they're like these plant nutrients that you can only get through certain plants. But these isoflavones in soy are also known as phytoestrogens. So obviously estrogen it's a human hormone. It's a steroid hormone, and that promotes female sex characteristics and reproductive growth during reproductive years. So the fact that soy has what's called as plant estrogens, I suppose, lends itself to the extrapolation that if you eat soy, you may become, more feminine, and it may have feminizing effects in the body. And I think that's what we're going to kind of move on to. But yeah, that's pretty much, I don't know if you agree with my characterization there, but I think that's probably the biggest reason why it's this question comes up. And to also just say that there have been, there have been a couple of case reports in the literature that have shown that like people eating a ridiculously high amount of soy. So you're talking like, 15 servings a day, something like 3.5 liters of soy milk have shown like, some estrogenic effect, such as some small tissue growth in the breast region and that sort of thing. So I think extrapolating from those, couple of case reports really has driven this narrative, and that's why it's so widespread.
In these case reports, it's not actually known if it was the soy which caused this, right? It could have just been malnutrition, because if you're eating so many servings of soy, there's a high chance you're not having a well-balanced diet as well, right?
Yeah, of course. And, you can make these kind of suggestions, but even within the study design or, of a case report, when you look at a hierarchy of evidence, it sits at the bottom because you've got nothing to compare it to. So in order to make a causal inference, you need to have a group to compare a treatment to. And in this instance, you're just seeing, something in one person, and you really can't give it more credence than just, okay, that's a bit of an interesting observation. But what we do then to, I suppose, get to understand whether this is a real observation, then we test that sort of idea in, randomized controlled trials or in prospective cohort studies, depending on what question you're talking about. For soy, it lends itself to a randomized controlled trial design. And then you look at, okay, if I have, X amount of people, more than one person, and I give them soy and I compare them to people who don't get it, then do these, feminizing effects take place? That's really what you want to look at, and that's, of course, that's what we're going to move on to, because that's been done. So in terms of like the article that I wrote for my nutrition science, I obviously touched on those kind of case reports, but really there's been like a lot of investigation into this question, and the results essentially show that soy doesn't tend to have any sort of effect on either testosterone or estrogen in males, and the same pretty much in females. And I'll go through the specifics now in a second. But yeah, like even just to kind of circle back, just to the kind of, before we get into that, for the conceptualization, if of how you make decisions about foods, like sitting, using two case reports or a case report here, a small study there, to generalize about a food group across a whole population, or across just as its inherent effects on some sort of outcome, is just, it's not how we do this sort of thinking. It's not how scientific thinking evolves. It's not how consensus forms. It's not how scientists think, because it gives us very low resolution information. So then we go to the kind of the higher up the evidence hierarchy, and we look at those kind of more robust study designs to see if there's any real effect.
As you mentioned, soy has a very good profile. In terms of amino acids, all plants have all amino acids to some extent, but in soy, it's quite balanced, the different essential amino acids, which makes it particularly special. It's got a little bit of a higher fat content, right, compared to other legumes, which makes it suitable for all ranges of diet, including ketogenic, low carb, which other beans may not. So he talks about isoflavones, which have a similar structure to estrogen, but that combine to the receptors. And I've seen that there's some evidence that this could actually have a beneficial effect on the body as well, such as reducing risk of breast cancer in women. Have you looked into this?
Yeah, so what you have to realize with these phytoestrogens is that, yes, they can bind to our own body's estrogen receptors, but first of all, they're much weaker than our own body's estrogen. So the estimates are somewhere, they range between about 100 to 1,000 times weaker than mammalian estrogen, so our own body's estrogen. So if they do bind to certain estrogen receptor sites, they can have much weaker effects. They can block our own estrogen and the effects of that, which may have downstream effects on different health conditions. And they're known as selective estrogen receptor modulators because depending on the tissue, in some tissues, they can be what we call agonists. and in some tissues they can be antagonists. So essentially they can have estrogenic or estrogenic effects depending on the tissue and depending on the concentration of the phytoestrogen as well. With respect to breast cancer, there's been a number of meta-analyses looking at breast cancer. There was one in 2008, there was a couple at 2013, 2014, and then the last one I saw was 2019. In these meta-analyses, soy isoflavone intake was associated between 11 and 29% reduced risk of breast cancer. But there was a bit of an interesting observation, was that in these studies, the majority of effects were seen in Asian women. So when you look at Asian versus Western women, you kind of saw a difference, whereas in the Western women, it was a non-significant effect, whereas you saw significant effects in Asian populations. And there are a number of reasons why this may be the case. So first of all, Western women eat a lot less soy. So if you are looking at a contrast of, let's say, high versus low intake in this particular population, if it's a very low intake on both the low end and the high end, you're not really, you're not going to expect to see much of a difference then in the outcome you're looking at. Whereas in Asian women, those contrasts are generally much higher. I think the average intake of soy in Asian populations is about 30 to 50 milligrams per day of the isoflavones. And in Western women, in Western populations, it's about, I think, 1 to 3 milligrams per day. So there is a difference there. There's also this interesting idea that eating soy in adolescence can protect against some things in the future. And this is seen in breast cancer data as well as some other outcomes. And so when you look, if you stratify by individuals in Western populations who only eat soy from adulthood, you often see no significant association. But if you look at those who eat in adolescence through adulthood, or even in some cases just in adolescence and then not in adulthood, sometimes you do see reduced risk for certain health outcomes. So that's just a consideration to keep in the back of your mind as well. And then there is also, and I guess I'm talking a bit more broadly here, but when it comes to health effects of soy, there is this phenomenon called, there's a phenomenon called Equol Producers. So there's some people who can produce this compound called Equol, and then there's some people who can't, and I'll kind of explain that a little bit more. So the main phytoestrogens in soy are genistein and daidzein. I think I'm pronouncing that correct. That's how it's written anyway. But so daidzein, there are some people who have a gut microbiome that has a sufficient bacteria that can metabolize daidzein into Equol. And the idea is that these people, so they're called Equol producers, tend to have the kind of health benefits associated with soy intake. And I suppose that's a bit of I don't think that's like, ironclad. I don't think it's fully understood. But I think one of the mechanisms is that it can bind to estrogen receptors to a greater degree than genistein and daidzein. And in particular, that's actually important because daidzein in and of itself does not bind to estrogen receptor as much as genistein does. So if that's metabolized into Equol, the idea is that may have some health benefits there. And then that's, as I kind of said, one of the differences between Asian and Western populations is that I think about 50% of Asians have the intestinal bacteria that can convert daidzein into Equol. So, and if you compare it to Westerners, it's about 25%. So it's a lower percentage. So that may give a kind of a clue as well as to why we see some positive health outcomes in Asian populations, and we don't necessarily see it as much in Western populations.
This Equol, is this only having a beneficial effect in women, or does it do any positive effects on men as well?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, it's not sex specific. Yeah, I don't believe it's sex specific, but just in terms of the breast cancer literature, that could be a consideration to keep in mind. But there are some studies that don't look at it. They don't assess differences in Equol producers versus non-producers, so it's kind of hard to characterize at times, depending on what you're looking at.
What is Equol production good for exactly? Is it exclusively for reduced cancer risk, or has it got other beneficial health outcomes?
As far as I know, as a general statement, the production of Equol can have health benefits, but I'm not sure if it's specific to a particular outcome.
Some observational interventional studies suggest that the ability to produce Equol is associated with reduced risk of breast, prostate cancer, CVD, improved bone health, and reduced incidence of hot flushes. Link this in the show notes for people to have a read.
I know there was a recent trial where they gave women supplements that varied in their isoflavone concentrations. And then they looked at, and the outcome was bone health, or markers of bone health. And they looked at Equol producers versus non-producers. And in that particular trial, they saw that being an Equol producer didn't seem to have much of an effect on the kind of the bone health outcomes. But I mean, it's not something I'm super familiar with. I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but I guess it's something to just keep in the back of your mind when you're looking at Asian versus Western populations.
Each gram of soy protein in soybeans is associated with approximately 3.5 milligrams of isoflavones. So consequently, one serving of traditional soy food, such as 100 grams of tofu or 250 milliliter soy milk, typically provides around 25 milligrams of isoflavones. So we've defined isoflavones. In your article, you've also got a term called androgenic. How do you define that?
Yes, so an androgen is any natural or synthetic steroid hormone that regulates the development and maintenance of male characteristics. So essentially, you can think of an androgen, that the kind of most, I suppose, well-known would be testosterone, as these kind of hormones that stimulate development of the male kind of secondary sexual characteristics. Yeah, so if we're talking about a substance that is androgenic, then we would be saying that it produces or it would stimulate the development of male characteristics.
In your article, you've got free and total testosterone as coming under testosterone. What is the difference between free and total testosterone?
Yeah, so total testosterone reflects free testosterone. It reflects the testosterone that's bound to a protein called sex hormone binding globulin. And then it reflects the testosterone that's bound to albumin. So that's another blood protein. So free testosterone is more bioactive. So what that means is it can bind to the androgen receptors, and it can have effects, I guess, in the body, such as, like, for example, it would associate with bone mineral density. It would associate with erectile dysfunction as well, low free testosterone. Whereas total testosterone is a bit more of it's a less sensitive marker of androgen kind of status. The kind of, I think, like free testosterone plus the albumin bound testosterone, which can be about 20 to 40% of total testosterone, plus the free testosterone is about 2 to 3%. That's generally regarded as the bioavailable, kind of biologically active testosterone. Whereas the 60 to 80% of total testosterone that's bound to this sex hormone binding globulin is regarded as kind of inactive. So really, free testosterone, looking at that is probably a better measure of how androgenic, I suppose, your hormones, like how much of a particular androgenic hormone you have that's actually having an effect in the body, if that makes sense.
Free testosterone is most important. Yeah. The range is quite big for testosterone, the optimal range. So theoretically, you could reduce your testosterone, but it could not really be a problem if you're still within the range.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one because I don't think there really is a hard cutoff with testosterone. So I think like anywhere from kind of 250 nanograms per deciliter up to about 800 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter is typically what you see as a normal range. But there's no perfect cutoff that would perfectly kind of separate your normal status to I suppose, a non-normal or hypogonadal status. And I think sometimes it can be, you can be on the lower range and feel great. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because you hit a certain number there that you all of a sudden, need to get that testosterone up. So, and this will feed into some of the stuff we talk about, but, if you do see a decrease in testosterone within that range, it's not really something that we're clinically, worried about.
Lower testosterone associated with decreased prostate cancer. We covered most of the main terms except estrogen, 2 terms for estrogen. Maybe I'm not pronouncing them correct. Estradiol and Oestrone, is this correct?
Yeah.
Or how do you say them?
That's how I say it. So
Yeah.
we could be both wrong, but I think we're okay. Yeah. So they're the main estrogens, and estradiol is actually the main form that is present throughout life in a female. Estrone continues to be made actually after the menopause, but with respect to the strongest type of estrogen, estradiol would be the main one and the kind of strongest one. But yeah, that's basically that. I mean, there are other types. There's estriol and estetrol, and that estetrol is only formed during pregnancy, and estriol is during pregnancy as well. And then estrone is also, it can be a stored form of estrogen, and it can convert to estradiol when it's needed to be. But yeah, that's pretty much that.
So it's a little bit different compared to the free versus total testosterone.
Yeah, I think most of the time people would talk about estrogen and it would be estradiol or estradiol, however you want to pronounce it, because it is the most abundant one, and it's the one that seems to drive most of the effects of estrogen. But yeah, I don't think you could say that one is inert, if that makes sense.
Let's jump into your articles. You have 2 really big meta-analyses within the articles. One looks at testosterone. There's a lot claimed online that soy is a weapon trying to make men female.
Soy lowers your testosterone. Yeah, soy isoflavones can produce estrogen-like activity in the body, mimicking the effects of natural estrogen. But I think you
can grow titties off of soy?
Not quite, but it might feminize you.
I want to talk about the problems with soy. It gives you a lot of problems.
I don't want to demonize a bunch of foods. That's not my style. I'm more about promoting positivity and what you should eat. But there's some foods that just deserve their own video, so you can really learn why you should avoid them. And when it comes to soy, the odds are just stacked against them. They got so many things going against them. You should not be putting this stuff in your body.
It's going to be soy, and soy is the most harmful thing you could use for messing up your hormones. If you want to have a kid who doesn't know their gender, feed it soy. It's the best way to mess up your hormones, get tits, become really overly estrogenic and feminized. I'm pretty sure soy is a weapon.
Let's first have a look at this meta-analysis on testosterone. What did you find in terms of the outcomes?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, there have been case reports where people who had a lot of, ate a lot of soy, essentially nearly like an all soy diet nearly, had, some sort of health problems and potential estrogenic activity. But of course, if we want to really answer this question, what we have to do is look at all the published trials where you have randomization, where you get a similar group of people, you put them into separate groups, and you give one group, soy food intake or soy isoflavone intervention, and then you give the other placebo, and then you look at differences in the kind of outcomes we're looking at. So that's kind of testosterone and estrogen and different subtypes within each. So in this particular meta-analysis was conducted in 2021. This was an updated meta-analysis from a prior one done about 10 years prior to that, as far as I'm aware. And they included 41 trials and almost, getting up to about 2,000, so nearly 2,000 participants, about 1,750. And essentially, I mean, the bottom line is they saw no significant impact of either soy foods or isoflavone interventions on total testosterone, free testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, estradiol, or estrone. So they're really, and if you look at the effect sizes in the table, it's very much, there's very little effect to be gleaned from that, and the variability around the confidence intervals, it's extremely variable. So this is really, really good evidence that soy does not, when eaten in, recommended serving sizes and amounts in a reasonable diet, soy will have no impact or no measurable impact on testosterone or estrogen in men. And they also sub-analyzed by studies that looked at higher intakes of soy. So they looked at studies where people were ingesting more than 75 milligrams per day of soy isoflavones. So that would equal, as you referred to earlier on, that would equal about 3 servings per day of a typical kind of food, such as soy milk, tofu, or whatever. And even in that subgroup of studies, there was no significant effect on any of these hormones. So really, I think this is an updated meta-analysis where they've included 41 studies, nearly 2,000 participants. You've got a huge amount of people to look at here. And if they're not finding any signal in that, I don't see how anyone can make the claim that soy influences hormones.
And the studies they were looking at, were they all randomized controlled trials?
Yeah, they were all randomized controlled trials, and the majority were parallel trials. So what that means is that one group would get the soy intervention, either food or isoflavone, and the other group would get some sort of placebo. And they would follow them from baseline to the end of the experiment, and then they'd look at the differences in testosterone, in estrogen, in the outcomes of interest. And I believe in this particular meta-analysis that the studies range from about 3 to 12 weeks, if I'm remembering correctly, which is more than enough time to see these kind of changes in these hormones. So yeah, it was a very rigorous meta-analysis, and the results are the results, and they do give us a lot of confidence that soy in kind of reasonable serving sizes, in a reasonable dietary pattern, that doesn't have any sort of effect really on testosterone or estrogen, in men at least.
Okay, that's very assuring, because I eat soy pretty much every day, and I think 3 servings. How much is a serving of tofu? Is it about 100 grams?
I think it's about 85 grams. But I mean, like, whether that's firm or, the way it can change by the water content. So I'd say in around the 100 grams region is fair enough approximation.
I'll typically have probably a block of tofu a day plus soy milk.
Yeah, that's okay. Look, you can do the human flag and everything, can't you? You can do. I saw you do a muscle up, so that's all you need to do, is just to get people on board. Say soy isn't going to ruin your testosterone, and just put the clip of you doing a muscle up, and we're sorted.
Perfect. I'll do this after. I appreciate the compliment.
And of course.
You looked at another meta-analysis as well from 2009. Is that correct?
Yeah. So this one was Hooper et al. 2009. So in this study, they looked at, if I recall correctly, about 47 trials. The study population was women this time. So they were looking at the effects of soy foods and isoflavones on estrogen and some other hormones as well, like progesterone and a few other ones. But mainly for this conversation, focus on the estrogen and the results across groups. So they grouped them into pre, peri, and postmenopausal women. Once again, there was no significant effect of soy or soy isoflavone interventions on estrogen in these cohorts. Now, there was, in postmenopausal women, there was a trend towards or like a borderline significant increase in estradiol in postmenopausal women. But when they actually sub-analyzed that result by the type of food, or if it was an isoflavone supplement, they found that soy foods and isolated soy proteins didn't impact or have a significant effect on estradiol, whereas soy isoflavone supplements did. So that could be something just to keep in mind for people. But also, I think, you have to, first of all, think, okay, let's say there was an increase. Let's say it's a real increase with the soy isoflavone. We have to look at whether that's a good, is that inherently bad? Is that a good thing? We know that estrogen seems to have cardioprotective properties and protective effects on bone markers and bone health as well. And oftentimes when people go through menopause, and postmenopausal women will have then a much higher risk for cardiovascular events and for osteoporosis. So I'm not even sure if that is would be a negative finding if it is true. But I think the take home point is that soy foods don't seem to have any sort of impact really.
That's good to know. Everything also should be in moderation. Maybe you should not just try and get all your protein from soy. You can always mix it up just to be on the safe side. So
with diets, why limit it? I mean, like, soy is a great food source. I think, there's associations with soy with reduced risk of a lot of different things. I mean, there's a 2020 umbrella review that looked at like cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes, different types of cancers, and the tens of results you see are either reductions in risk, like for a lot of these outcomes, or no real effect. I mean, there's really doesn't seem to be any downside to eating soy. So of course, I think incorporating soy would be probably a step forward for a lot of people, particularly if it's replacing something that might be less beneficial for kind of long-term health, maybe meat or something like that. But of course, like why just eat that? I mean, there's an array of legumes, there's an array of foods that are on offer to you to have a healthy diet. So I don't see why you'd go down the road of having 6, 7, 8 servings a day. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. Seitan, corn, or just beans. Yeah, there's plenty. You don't have to have soy or tofu for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Especially, look, if someone doesn't like it too, but you still, like, if people are interested in eating more plant-based or incorporating some more plant protein into their diet, if you don't like soy, if you hate soy milk, if you don't like the texture, if you don't like tofu, you think it's weird, whatever, there's a plenty of other protein sources and things that can come in place of that, such as, like you said, seitan, some of those kind of legumes. Like there's a whole range of legumes, different beans, lentils, lentil pastas are great for adding in a bit of protein to otherwise will be just like a lower protein food or whatever. A lot of fiber too. And then obviously some of these kind of phytoestrogens that are in these, in either soy or even some of these kind of other polyphenols and compounds in the other legumes are obviously, they're going to have some positive effects for your health as well. So it is a good swap and a good kind of switch to make.
Do you have corn where you are in Ireland?
Yes, we do. There's the majority of it is, I think, like vegetarian. So there's like egg in a good few of the products. They do have vegan stuff as well. But corn's a really, like, if you're someone who's interested in, maximizing muscle protein synthesis and and I suppose muscle and that sort of thing, corn seems to, in any of the research I've seen on the mycoprotein, which is what it is, it seems to be, even superior to things like milk protein for muscle protein synthesis. And then I know there was a recent trial published looking at a high protein vegan diet that had a lot of corn in it. So, because I think the study was sponsored by corn, showing actually increased, now there was no statistical difference between muscle gain and strength gain between that group and the omnivore group, but there were like small increases so in those outcomes and similar muscle protein synthesis results as well.
Yeah, I saw that paper as well, but I didn't know that it was sponsored by corn.
Yeah, that was big corn.
The plant-based side, were they only having corn products, or did they have also some plant-based protein sources?
I think like corn there was a decent amount. I think like for the amount of grams they were having, if I recall correctly, they were eating about 200 and something grams of protein per day. And I think maybe 50, 60 of that was like true corn.
Okay.
So it certainly wasn't their whole diet. And look, that's off the top of my head. I could be a little bit wrong there with those numbers, but it certainly wasn't like their entire protein intake.
We've covered soy and misinformation. Is there something you want to add?
Yeah, I'll add, just because in the article I mentioned the 2 case reports where people had really, really high soy intakes and they had some potential, negatives to that. There were also 2 small studies that showed decreases in testosterone. So I'll just cover them very quickly. In one of the studies, I think there was 12 or 13 participants. So it was a small enough sample size. They were given, I think, 58 grams a day of soy protein in their diet. And then at the end of the intervention period, they did have a statistically significant decrease in testosterone. But if you actually go and look at that decrease, I think it was 400. They started with 411 nanograms per deciliter, and they dropped to 393. So that's I believe it's an 18 nanogram per deciliter drop. And that is literally, that could just be a variation of like an everyday normal kind of variation, between tests or whatever. So I think like extrapolating from that soy, causes problems with testosterone, I think will be very short-sighted, particularly with the meta-analysis where you're looking at 1,753 people versus 12. And also just to note with that study, if you go to the paper, if you look at figure 1, so there's a graph that shows each individual in the study's testosterone. And there's one participant in the study who has like a massive drop in testosterone, but everybody else, it looks pretty much like nothing changed or like very small changes. So there's one person kind of skewing that result as well. So I just don't think you can generalize that to soy as a food group effects on testosterone. And then finally, there was one other study that gave scones made out of soy flour. And I believe they kind of ate about 120 milligrams of soy isoflavones per day, which would be, I mean, if you calculate that out, it's probably 6 servings per day of soy. They had small decreases in testosterone. Again, very, very small decreases that would have no bearing on anything. You would never even know it happened. You wouldn't have any problems associated with that. So I think just understanding that, and again, that was, I think there's 19 people in that study. Passing that to the meta-analysis is, it pales in comparison to what sort of inferences we can draw from that.
Brilliantly said. And I think that brings us to the end of the article. We pretty much covered everything there.
Yeah, and just to like literally, I think the last line of the article was something along the lines of, fearing soy because of some potential effects it can have on testosterone really is to be discouraged, because there are these health benefits associated with it. It's even if we talk from a nutrient point of view, for people, especially if they're swapping meat for soy, and you'd be lower in certain nutrients than if you don't replace it with something with a similar profile. I mean, there's a good bit of iron in most soy foods, decent amount of zinc. I know like soy milk, fortified soy milk is a great source of calcium. Calcium set tofu, most of the tofu is set with calcium, so it's another good source of calcium. And then of course protein, and then these isoflavones that may have some downstream health effects, possibly helping to prevent things like cardiovascular disease and certain cancers.
Tofu is great for calcium. A block of tofu can get you about 1,000 milligrams of calcium. It's amazing.
That's pretty significant. I mean, that's like, that'd be your full day recommended allowance, really. I mean, even I think the UK, like the recommended daily allowance is 700, I think. And I know like I think international ones might be 800 milligrams per day. So yeah, 1,000's a lot.
Have you looked into the calcium and calcium set tofu?
Yeah, do you have the brand Cauldron? That's the one I would usually buy. I think, I'm not sure, per 100 gram, I think you're looking at about, this is my estimation, but about 150 milligrams, but I could be wrong there. That's what I would have thought, but it probably depends on how firm it is as well. But it, like, regardless, if you're having, a few servings of tofu, you're already getting probably in the region of 300, 400 milligrams, something in that region. And then if you add to that, having either, if you eat dairy milk or some fortified like soy milk or whatever, you're already up to that kind of reaching that RDA. And that's, without accounting for things in vegetables. And I know like some cruciferous green leafy vegetables are quite high in calcium too. But I wouldn't hinge my diet around them. I'd base the calcium in my diet personally around those kind of better sources like fortified milks or tofu and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the range, as you mentioned, does vary. It depends on how firm the tofu is. I think also chia seeds are a good source of calcium. A tablespoon of chia seeds, tahini as well.
Yeah, I think it's important with the chia seeds just to make sure that you're eating them either ground or when they've been soaked, because I know if you just throw them into something straight kind of as they are, as far as I'm aware, we don't really break it down. It has to be kind of broken down for us, either soaked or ground.
Yeah, the chia seeds, they tend to absorb the water and form a gel-like substance. It's good to soak them. Thanks a lot for tuning in. You can support Foolproof Mastery in a number of ways. First of all, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a review on Apple Podcasts with an honest opinion of what you think. Leave plenty of comments on YouTube and share with your friends, family and colleagues if you feel that you have learned something new, in order to keep on getting the knowledge out to as many people as possible. Finally, keep on living every day to the maximum, and see you next time for another episode. Ciao.